But first of all, I'm going to start off by looking at the end, the very last minutes of his life. Heinrich Himmler, chief of the SS, was dead at 11:15 p.m. on the evening of May the 23rd, 1945. The war had been over for 2 or 3 weeks by then. At the end of the war, he was up near Denmark, near the Danish frontier, with his dwindling band of men, with 150 men altogether. He had his bodyguard with him, his escort troops, his detectives, his secretaries, his code breakers, the clerks, and the drivers. And one by one, he sent them all home until 2 weeks later, he's left there just with his 2 closest friends, his adjutants, SS Major Macher and SS Major Grothmann. I knew them both. They're both dead now, of course, along with their boss. They last saw him on the evening of May the 23rd, 1945, when they ran into a British Army patrol on a bridge as they began their long journey south. He was trying to get back home to Munich, where he was born. And he was heading south on foot with his 2 trusty adjutants when they stumbled into a British Army patrol on the bridge at Bremerförde, who looked at their papers and immediately arrested them because their fake papers, their false identity papers, were made out as German military police, which was an automatic arrest category, stupidly enough. So they were automatically arrested and taken to a prison camp at Vesterdemke nearby. The commandant of that camp was Captain Sylvester. These 2 men languished in his camp, the 3 men languished in the camp for 2 or 3 days, and eventually Heinrich Himmler got tired of that, and he went to the commandant Sylvester and said, "I am really Heinrich Himmler." And he then signed his name on a piece of paper to prove it, the familiar jagged script, Heinrich Himmler, Gothic script, which very few Germans nowadays can read. So the commandant, Sylvester, telephoned British Army headquarters in nearby Lüneburg and said, "We've got a big one here, we've got Heinrich Himmler. No doubt about it. I've seen him and I think he's Himmler." And the colonel in charge of the intelligence unit at British Army headquarters, Colonel Murphy, immediately said, "I'll come over and pick him up." Now, I've got Murphy's account of this. He wrote a handwritten account at that time. And in the handwritten account, he says, "I got the phone call from Vesterdemke, and I said, I'll come straight over with a couple of staff officers and pick him up." And I drove over with a couple of staff officers to Vesterdemke and picked up Himmler, and we drove him to a house we had prepared for the purpose. Strange wording. It's almost as though there's something he wants to say but can't. And we do know that everyone who was in that house was sworn to official secrets by having to sign the British Official Secrets Act on the following day. There was something they saw or knew about that they weren't allowed to talk about ever for the rest of their lives under pain of imprisonment. If you go to YouTube, go to the internet, you will see there's a picture of me standing outside that house, a film of me standing outside that house in June 2010 with Janelle, my assistant then. She took it. And I'm talking about what went on in that room behind me, the one with the big bay windows, the discrepancies, the things that don't fit. I wanted to see the house myself. It was quite a risk. Had the German police picked me up and asked to see my papers, it would have been an automatic arrest also, because I'm banned from Germany in the interest of the German people. Ever since 1993, the German government handed me a letter banning me in the interest of the German people. And it means, of course, effectively in the interest of a certain group of German people, but not the German people as such, all of whom were my best admirers and friends. But I had to see the house because I wanted to see which way that window pointed. You'll understand why in a minute. Colonel Murphy, anyway, he writes in his account, I went over and picked him up, put him on the back seat of my car, and the official version of the story is that Himmler in that house shortly after managed to bite on a cyanide capsule which he concealed at the back of his mouth despite all the efforts of the doctors, and he was dead. I'm going to play to you now a 3-minute BBC recording of a British Army officer who was in the camp at that time in that house, and he was a witness of Himmler's death.
Hello BBC, this is Chester Wilmot speaking from Lüneburg, where Himmler committed suicide last night. One of the men with him in the room at the time, at 31 Ulsener Strasse, was Sergeant Major Edwin Austin of Mortlake in Surrey. And I've brought him to the microphone to tell you what happened. Sergeant Major Austin.
Before I arrived, I didn't know it was Himmler. I was only told there was an important prisoner whom I was to guard. As he came into the room, not the arrogant figure which we all know, but dressed in an army shirt, a pair of underpants with a blanket wrapped round him, I immediately recognized him as Himmler. Speaking to him in German, and pointing to an empty couch, I said, "That's your bed. Get undressed." He looked at me and then looked at an interpreter and said, "He doesn't know who I am." I said, "Yes, I do. You're Himmler. But still, that's your bed. Get undressed." He tried to stare me out, but I stared at him back. And eventually he dropped his eyes and sat down on the bed and started to take off his underpants. The doctor and the colonel then came into the room and started to carry out a routine inspection, looking for poison, which we suspected he probably had on him. He looked between his toes, all over his body, under his armpits, in his ears, behind his ears, in his hair, and then he came to his mouth. He asked Himmler to open his mouth. He did, and he ran his tongue around his lips quite easily, but the doctor wasn't satisfied. He asked him to come nearer to the light. He came nearer to the light and opened his mouth. The doctor tried to put 2 fingers into his mouth to have a good look inside, I suspected. And Himmler drew his head away and, clamping down on the doctor's fingers, crushed the phial of poison which he had been carrying in his mouth for hours. The doctor said, "He's done it." And the colonel and I instinctively jumped to him. The doctor held him by the throat as he was falling and tried to make him spit out the poison which he was swallowing, and the colonel and I held him. After a struggle lasting a quarter of an hour, in which we tried all methods of artificial respiration under the direction of the doctor, he died. And when he died, we threw a blanket over him and left him.
That's the official British version. The interview with Sergeant Major Edwin Austin on the day after the death of Heinrich Himmler. He's word perfect. I think you may agree that he's probably reading from a script. The script has been adapted slightly for the American audience. Chester Wilmot has obviously said to him, "Look here, old chap, this is the BBC. It's going to be broadcast all around the world, including the United States, and they sometimes use different words from us, regular chaps. So we say sofa, they say couch, we say pants, they say underpants. If you just say Himmler stood there in his pants, meaning underpants, the Americans are going to say, so what? No, you've got to say underpants." So you can hear how Austin actually pauses. He was standing there in his underpants. I pointed at the couch. So I think it's all been written, and he's been very careful he's been very careful to stick to the script, because he too is now subject to the Official Secrets Act. My warning here is, don't believe very much of what you've just heard him say. I think there's something very different happened to Himmler in that house, and the evidence is quite strong. First of all, for Himmler to have concealed a poison capsule in his mouth, where the doctor saw glinting at the back of the mouth, and then managing to crush it with his teeth, is completely unlikely. I'll show you first of all what these capsules look like. That's what the cyanide capsule looks like. Standard German issue cyanide capsule. This one was taken from Hermann Goering's property. This is the capsule there. It's 1.5 inches long, thin glass, carried around normally in a brass cartridge case with a screw cap, because you don't want the thing breaking in your pocket with nasty consequences. So you carried it in your pocket. You didn't carry it in your mouth, except when you were very close to the end. And the evidence is that Himmler didn't have that in his mouth. In fact, he didn't have it at all when he was sitting in that car driving the short distance from Westertemke to Lüneburg. We know that because Colonel Murphy, in his handwritten account, says, "I sat on the back seat of the car with Heinrich Himmler, one of my staff officers, and I chatted with him all the way for the 10-minute journey, and Himmler ate a British Army sandwich that had been given to him." Now, British Army sandwich, the Canadians will probably know this, the Americans won't. The Americans, you're accustomed when you have a sandwich, it's made of something like thick wads of Kleenex. British bread is, so if the sandwich doesn't kill you, then believe me, the cyanide capsule would have if you tried eating that sandwich with a cyanide capsule concealed in your mouth. And besides that, we know that even when they left the house, Heinrich Himmler hadn't got that cyanide capsule in him. Well, there's now a picture of the same cyanide capsule in somebody's hand. It's a big thing. You can't conceal it inside a hollow tooth, which is one version. You can't conceal it between two teeth at the back of your mouth. You can't do any of those things. Even then, you can only do that if you actually got one. And we do know that when Himmler identified himself to Captain Sylvester invested him to camp, said, he called in a couple of officers and he said to Himmler, you will go to that corner of the room, take all your clothes off, then walk to this corner of the room naked and put on British clothing. And one of the officers described that in a report which is in the British files. It says, we made him undress, we went through his clothing, his own clothing, we found his cyanide capsule and I gave it to you, sir. To Colonel Murphy. Colonel Murphy was carrying that cyanide capsule in his pocket when he sat in that car. Heinrich Himmler didn't have one concealed about him in his mouth or anywhere else. And quite apart from that, well, let's find out who Colonel Murphy is. Colonel Murphy, there's a famous painting, an oil painting, of the surrender on Lüneburg Heath. Field Marshal Montgomery, the British Army commander, accepting the surrender of the German generals on Lüneburg Heath, painted by a British war artist, and very good war artist. And in the back of that painting, you can see a British Army colonel standing there. That's Colonel Murphy with the red hat band and all the rest. That's Colonel Murphy. He managed to wangle his way into the painting because he, as he said to Montgomery, I'm the one who brought this surrender about. I'm the one who carried the messages to and fro. I have a right to be in the painting. And he's also in another painting later on, which I'll talk about, the same guy. That capsule was not in Heinrich Himmler's possession. So what happened in that room? Well, the doctor gave a description also, which I've also got. The doctor says, I made Heinrich Himmler take all his clothes off. I searched him, and it's very similar to the version that Austin gives in that BBC interview. I searched him, I looked in his mouth, and I thought I saw something glinting at the back of the mouth. I asked him to come over to the light and look in his mouth, except in his version, Austin says, the doctor told him to come over to the light. The doctor himself, in his version of this, he writes, I asked him to come over to the window so I could get a better look in his mouth. And everyone's believed that, except it's 11 p.m. at night. There is no window. There's no light coming through that window. I know I've stood outside that house for that very purpose. I wanted to see which way it faced. I wanted to see whether there were any street lamps outside, even if the street lamps would have been working 1 week after the war was over, effectively. It was the only house that wasn't destroyed by bombing. That's why the British had taken it over for their intelligence unit, for this purpose. There was no. Why did the doctor lie? Well, it's possible that he wanted to cover up the fact that he wanted Himmler just to stand in the room with his back to everybody in the room for some reason, while the doctor told him to open his mouth for some purpose. But as a historian, I don't always join the dots. All I can say is this and that, and I leave my readers to come up with possible conclusions. We do have the record, the war diary of the unit that ran that house. It was called the British Second Army Defence Company, an intelligence unit. It ran that house. They kept a war diary on printed British Army war diary paper. I've got a few pages of it here. There's only 3 pages from May 1945. You can see that here. There's 3 pages like this. I've got the other 2 pages here. They're important because page 1 describes what happened on the first 3 weeks of May 1945, how they brought in other prisoners to that house. Kurt Daluger, he was brought in. He was sent back to England. The famous German police chief, number 2 under Himmler, sent back to England for interrogation and eventually turned over to the Czechs, who strangled him to death a year or 2 later. Kurt Daluger, SS Gruppenführer Pritzmann, he was brought into that house. He emerged feet first, dead like Himmler. Bit of a coincidence, that. Lord Haw was brought in, the famous British traitor. William Joyce was brought in. His wife came into that house. That's on the first page of this war diary. You see it's a printed form. Left-hand column says date and time. Middle column says what's happening. You'll understand why in a minute. The third column lists any kind of telegrams and appendices to be looked at. Page 2 describes the death of Himmler on 23rd of May 1945, the official version. Page 3 describes what happened thereafter. For example, Himmler's brother is brought in, Gebhard. Then they take fingerprints of the body. The body lies on the floor for 3 days. I've got a number of photographs here of the body lying on the floor. It's interesting. I'll show them to you briefly, and you can look at them afterwards when we come to an interval. There's Himmler lying on the floor, British official photograph, lying on the floor wearing glasses. Oh, they're not his glasses. They've just been put on his face for some reason. Probably so he looks like Heinrich Himmler. There's another photograph of him lying on the floor. He's not moved, of course, very much. A bowl of water there, as though something has been mopped up. You begin looking then, like CSI, looking for all the details. There he is lying on the floor again. Same room, same position, arms folded on his face, still wearing the glasses. He's there for 3 days altogether. You wonder why. British officers sitting around him, the body lying on the floor, still there. Another picture of Himmler lying on the floor. Rather a better one, that one. And then a picture taken by a British soldier who walked past the house one night and decided to have a look through the window, and there he sees Himmler lying on the floor. So he and a mate, they jump in through the window with a box Brownie camera, proper light up, proper old Heine up against the chair to get a better picture of him, and they take this picture. I've got a couple of other pictures too. Himmler lies on that floor for 3 days, as is evidenced by the war diary. And then American officers are brought in on the second day to satisfy themselves that Heinrich Himmler has been caught, that he is now dead. And they stand around the body. There's a photograph of them standing around the body. The American officers, high-ranking general, saying, well, it sure looks like Heine to me, and he's certainly not moving very much. And then the Russians are brought in, and there's a picture of the Russians standing next to the body. And they say that, yes, he does appear to be dead. Mr. Himmler, in Russian they will say Himmler. And then the body is wrapped up. After a few more testimony, they take fingerprints of the body. You've seen that on CSI, of course. Somebody has to take the fingerprints. The brain is removed and sent to England for some reason. Like Robert Lai, his brain was sent to England. And Mussolini's brain was sent to England for testing as well. And a death mask is taken. You know, a plaster cast is made of the dead face. And I've got a picture of it here. Heinrich Himmler dead, the plaster cast. I've shown this to a forensic pathologist, and he said, oh boy, he's been badly beaten, hasn't he? I said, oh? Oh yes, he said, look how the right-hand side of the face is swollen, and the eye is cut and already bloated. And well, that hadn't occurred to me. It was interesting to know. And then the body is wrapped in a blanket and tied up with telephone wire, neck, waist and feet, and loaded onto the back of a pickup truck and taken out and buried at sea. Oh no, that was Bin Laden. Taken out and buried in the middle of the Lüneburg Heath after midnight one night. Who buries bodies in the middle of a heath after midnight? Murderers do that kind of thing. The British Army, they've got one of the most important prisoners ever, and he's not taken back to England. He emerges from that house feet first and dead, and he's then buried in the middle of the heath. We wonder why. And we begin to get closer to the story when we examine that war diary again of the unit. We find that page 2, the page describing the death of Heinrich Himmler, has been retyped by someone. If you look at the original documents, that's what I'm good at. You look at original documents, you can see who's typed it. Because each typist has their own characteristics. And for some reason, that page describing Heinrich Himmler's death has been retyped by somebody who uses the figure 1 and the figure 0 when typing dates, whereas page 1 and page 3, the person uses the little l and the capital O when typing dates. And various other idiosyncrasies that people have, like 2 or 3 spaces after a period. You can see that whoever did page 2, describing the death of Heinrich Himmler, has retyped it. For some reason, at the same time, because it's the same typewriter, you can see the damage to some keys. It's the same time because you can see it's from the same pad of paper, and the ribbon isn't kind of darker or lighter. So around roughly the same time, for some reason, somebody ordered page 2 to be retyped. And people don't like retyping pages, not when it's got as many words as that on, about 50 lines of text. They will cross out lines, and they'll initial in the margin. The crossing out is official. But this was something that nobody must ever be able to read, and so they crossed it out and retyped the page. And we only can begin to guess what it is when we begin adding further evidence. And the next piece of evidence I'd give you is completely valueless. Ask any judge. The book was published in 1980 called The Illustrated History of the Waffen-SS. It's quite a well-known book with all the kind of coffee table pictures that military enthusiasts and history buffs like. Pictures of top SS generals and Heinrich Himmler reviewing troops, and daggers and guns and badges, and all the famous names, Sepp Dietrich, Hauser, Otto Skorzeny and all the rest. And right at the back of the book there is this picture of Heinrich Himmler lying on the floor. The commander of the SS, Reichsführer SS, Heinrich Himmler, May the 23rd, 1945, succeeded in swallowing cyanide and escaping justice. And a friend of mine, Steve Kerr, took this book out of Coventry Public Library in the late 1980s. It had just been published. Took it out of Coventry Public Library, took it home and got to that page, and he found that somebody had written in the margin, next to that photograph, which describes the official version of how Himmler committed suicide with a concealed cyanide capsule, thereby escaping justice. And somebody has written in the left-hand margin, that's not what happened. I know I was in that room. Sergeant Major Austin beat him to death. Wow. And I can understand at this moment any British judge would interrupt me immediately and say, Mr. Irving, go no further. You must realize that what you have just said has no evidentiary value whatsoever. An anonymous remark by somebody who's not even prepared to sign his name, claiming to have been in that room, totally reversing the official British version of what happened. Members of the jury will disregard what Mr. Irving... I mean, this will be stricken from the record. This is the kind of thing that happen in a court of law, but we're not in a court of law. We're looking here at history. And you have to start looking at human people. And you can imagine how some regular British Army soldier, who was one of the people in that room that night, who's been told that if he reveals what he saw, he will be sent to prison, doesn't want to die with that knowledge on his conscience. And so he's borrowed that book from the library, and he finds there's the same old story being trotted out, and they're getting away with it. And he writes in the margin, that's not what happened. I know, I was in that. And he puts the book back in the library, and he says, there you are, my conscience is clear now. That's what I think happened. Being human, as you are as a historian, you understand why people do things. And later on I'm going to suggest the same humanity comes into the reason why I write the books. The NRA has a very interesting slogan that they use, which is, guns don't kill people, people kill people. And that's a pretty good guideline when you're looking at what is now called the Holocaust. I'm interested in who were the people behind it, who knew what and when did they know it, why did the people who were doing it do it? The questions like that. I'm looking at the... When people say, well, how many are we talking about? I say, I'm not really interested in figures. I'm interested in the people. And I'm interested in the man who wrote that inside that book too. It does therefore appear that Heinrich Himmler came to a sticky end, a very nasty end, and there's one final clue which I'll put to you, and that concerns the artist, the war artist who made that painting. The painting of the surrender on Lüneburg Heath. That same artist came down to the house in Lüneburg, the house specially prepared for the purpose, if you remember, the house that I'm standing outside. And the same artist was commissioned to do a painting of the surrender of Heinrich Himmler. I think he may even have been in the house when Himmler was still alive, because a bunch of his sketches for his paintings were published later on by the Illustrated London News. The Illustrated London News is a big format photogravure magazine, rather like Signal and Time and Life magazine. And they specialized in having artists who gave renderings of the sinking of the Titanic, and where no cameras were there. And there was no camera in that room either. One of his sketches of a picture of Heinrich Himmler standing, holding up his trousers. Another picture is Heinrich Himmler lying on the floor, already dead. Very good images. You will find them on my website. If you go to my website, /Himmler, capital H, /death, I think you'll probably find it there. The interesting thing is that, like all artists, when he's been commissioned to do a painting, he does a series of thumbnail sketches, little details, people's ears, their shoes, what kind of hats, what kind of their badges, what they look like. He made several sketches of Himmler lying on the floor, Himmler standing there, the British officers, the Russian officers standing there, they're going to be in the painting too. And then he does sketches of the details, and I've got an enlarged sketch here, an enlargement of one of the details here. There it is. This is the head of Heinrich Himmler standing, holding up his trousers. And you can see, like all good artists, he's labeled things. Bushy eyebrows is one thing. Bushy eyebrows, shadow chin, moustache, beginning to grow again. And here he writes, broken nose. Broken nose. Well, Himmler's nose wasn't broken when he arrived at that house. Probably wasn't broken after he was dead. Something happened in those 15 minutes that broke his nose. And it all fits in with the general picture of what the guy wrote next to the photograph in the printed book. Heinrich Himmler came to a violent end, not the official version given by the British afterwards, and subsequently the cowardly end, which enraged a lot of SS generals who said, well, he wasn't prepared to take the music, and so now we have to stand up and take the music instead. I've no doubt at all if he'd gone on to Nuremberg, he would have been hanged, and he would have richly deserved it. He was a very strange character. I'm not